It was the night of December 12th, 1976, when 19-year-old Paul Fox vanished without a trace from Long Beach, California. That day, he had helped set the table for a family dinner and then hurried out to meet friends, even leaving his wallet behind in his rush. Paul hopped into a car outside his home, expecting to return soon, but he never came back, and in fact, he was never seen again. Paul was the youngest of four brothers in a family of Hungarian immigrants. His parents, Paul Sr. and Elizabeth, had fled Soviet-occupied Hungary in the 1950s and built a new life in California. By 1976, the family lived in Long Beach, and young Paul, as they affectionately called him, was a recent high school graduate figuring out his future. He was working as a valet while he tried to figure out what the next steps he wanted to take in his life were. At 6 feet 3 inches tall with a light brown mustache, Paul was imposing, but also described as shy and polite. He was a talented artist and even handy around the house, and he could cook and sew his own clothes, a fact that his mother was very proud of. Most importantly, Paul was devoted to his family. He never left home without telling his mom where he was going and when he'd be back. Sometimes he would leave a note saying, for example, he was at a friend's house and would return in a few minutes. This responsible behavior made his sudden disappearance all the more baffling to his parents and brothers. On Sunday, December 12th, 1976, after eating an early supper at home, Paul headed out to meet friends at a local nightclub called Ripple's Bar in Long Beach. Ripple's was a popular spot on the waterfront, known as a gay-friendly dance bar. According to witnesses, Paul was seen at the club chatting with an unknown man, described as a strange man, not recognizable to his usual friend group. This would later turn out to be a critical clue. When midnight passed and Paul hadn't returned home, his family grew concerned. They discovered he had left behind his wallet and identification, which was very unlike him. By the next morning, the family reported Paul missing to the police and began searching for him in every way they knew how. Paul's family called all his friends and acquaintances, hoping someone had seen him after the club. They drove around Long Beach, checking his usual hangouts and even local hospitals, but there was no sign of Paul. When they pressed the Long Beach police for help, however, they were met with a frustrating response. And I bet I don't even have to say what that response was. But hey, if you're new to the genre, the cops told his family he was a runaway and told him he'd turn up soon. Being 19, Paul was legally an adult, and police noted that he had a pending misdemeanor charge for underage drinking and had missed a recent court appearance for it. To them, it may have been plausible that he might have taken off on his own to avoid that court date. His family emphatically rejected that idea. Paul had left on good terms, even setting the dinner table before going out, hardly something a plotting runaway would do. The family pleaded with authorities, insisting that Paul would never disappear voluntarily without contacting them. For days that turned into weeks, the family plastered missing person flyers around town and called the police regularly, trying to keep the case alive. But with no solid leads, their private investigation stalled. Months went by with no news. At some point after he disappeared, it does appear that the authorities started to take his case more seriously. But at that point, of course, valuable time had been lost. Periodically, the family endured terrible scares. Whenever an unidentified body was found that even loosely matched Paul's description, the authorities reached out. Officials would ask if Paul had a chipped tooth or inquire about his height, while the family's hearts pounded with anxiety, but it was never him. Over the years, Paul's parents chased every fleeting lead. In one instance, Paul's father learned of a crewman on a ship docked in Long Beach who happened to share his son's name. For a moment, they hoped Paul might turn up alive working on a boat. They tracked down that lead, only to find it was another man entirely. As time went on, Elizabeth was overcome with grief. Neighbors recalled that she cried every day, unable to find closure while her son was missing. Paul struggled as well, often having to leave the room when his wife broke down, because he had no words left to comfort her. In 1983, nearly 7 years after Paul disappeared, detectives from Orange County finally gave the Fox family a chilling update that they definitely didn't want to hear. They believed Paul had fallen victim to a serial predator who was active in Southern California, Randy Kraft. Kraft had been arrested that year and linked to a spree of brutal slayings of young men in the 1970s and early 1980s. There were several reasons investigators suspected a connection. Kraft was known to frequent Ripple's Bar in Long Beach, the very place where Paul was last seen. In fact, witnesses from 1976 later realized that the stranger spotted with Paul that night strongly resembled Randy Kraft. Even more damning, when police searched Kraft's car after his arrest, they found a handwritten list, a coded quote-unquote scorecard of his presumed victims. On this list was the entry named Ripples alongside an obscene phrase. Investigators interpreted that obscenity as a likely code name for Paul, given how it resembled Paul's last name. Essentially, Kraft's own records hinted that he picked up a victim from Ripples and used a crude nickname that pointed to Paul's case. And this is the point where I should probably mention that I'm not quite sure Fox is the correct pronunciation of his last name, but I'm going with it because we're on YouTube. By the fall of 1983, they informed Paul's parents that he could have been one of Randy Kraft's many unnamed victims. However, one officer quietly told them not to hold out hope that Paul was still alive or to keep any hope of a prosecution, since they definitely didn't have the evidence to prove it. It was a devastating revelation, marking the end of years of uncertainty with a worst-case conclusion. It also meant that if Paul wasn't the one that was targeted by Kraft, the cops had essentially treated his case as closed anyway and wouldn't be working it further. Randy Kraft eventually stood trial and was convicted in 1989 of 16 slayings, for which he was condemned. Paul's case was never officially included in the charges because there was no physical evidence like a body to present, but he was listed by law enforcement as a likely victim. To this day, Kraft maintains his innocence in all crimes and has never revealed what truly became of Paul's body. He remains locked up in California, his date with the big DP from the government indefinitely put on hold. Nearly 5 decades have passed since that fateful night in 1976, and Paul's fate is still not definitively known. His body has never been found, and his parents never got to properly say goodbye, going to their graves without knowing the absolute truth of what happened. Close your eyes for a moment and listen, not to the world you know, but to a world that's been silent for over 300 years. Imagine the sound of the island of Mauritius before humans. It's a symphony of buzzing insects, the rustle of giant tortoises through dense undergrowth, the calls of brightly colored parrots in trees. There's one very unusual noise, though, the pigeon-like coo of a large flightless bird, foraging for fallen fruit on the forest floor. This was the world of the dodo, an ecosystem that evolved in splendid isolation for millions of years. Now, listen again. That symphony is gone. In its place is a profound silence, a quiet defined by the absence of its most famous resident. The story of the dodo isn't the simple fable you might remember from childhood, the tale of a stupid bird that was too clumsy to survive. It's a far more complex and tragic story of a creature perfectly adapted to one world and catastrophically unprepared for the new one that arrived. Mauritius is a volcanic island, a lonely peak thrust up from the floor of the Indian Ocean, never connected to any mainland. This isolation was the master architect of its unique ecology. Before human settlement, it was a paradise cloaked in a mosaic of forests, from dry coastal woods to misty upland cloud forests, interspersed with palm-rich savannas. The most crucial feature of this world was what it lacked: terrestrial mammalian predators. With no large carnivores stalking the forest floor, the island's fauna evolved along a different path. Giant tortoises and skinks roamed freely, and the only native mammals were friendly bats that had made the perilous journey over the ocean there. In this sanctuary, the dodo's ancestors, pigeons that likely arrived from Southeast Asia millions of years ago, found an environment where their old adaptations were no longer necessary. Flying is an incredibly energy-intensive activity, a biological luxury maintained for escaping predators or finding scarce food. On Mauritius, food was abundant on the ground, and there was nothing to escape from ever. So, over countless generations, the dodo's ancestors traded the sky for the ground. Their wings shrank, their bodies grew larger and more robust. Similarly, their reproductive strategy adapted to this life of safety. With no predators to raid their nests, female dodos laid only a single, large egg at a time. This allowed them to invest all their energy into one promising offspring rather than simply blasting out as many eggs as possible and hoping one chick survives. The traits that would later be seen as flaws, flightlessness, largeness, and a low birth rate, weren't flaws at all. They were the pinnacle of evolutionary success in the peaceful world the dodo had always known. You might not like it, but this is what peak bird physiology looks like. The popular image of the dodo is a caricature, a comically fat, clumsy, and dim-witted bird. This picture, largely shaped by 17th century European artists like Roland Savory, painting overfed captive specimens, is almost entirely wrong. And in case you're one of those people who just listens, now would be the time to look. I'm sure this painting is familiar to many of you. Modern analysis of the dodo's skeletal structure reveals a bird that wasn't obese but athletic and robust, with strong legs capable of navigating the island's uneven terrain. In the wild, it likely weighed up to 40 pounds and was far leaner than the caricatures suggest. It also stood about 3.5 feet tall and was a powerful ground dweller perfectly suited to its niche. Its mind, too, has been unfairly maligned. The idea of the dumb dodo is likely a myth. For those of you who aren't native English speakers, dumb as a dodo is a fairly common phrase, meaning that someone is, well, exceedingly stupid. In 2016, scientists discovered that its brain-to-body size ratio was on par with that of a modern pigeon, a bird known for its intelligence and trainability. Even more revealing was the structure of its brain. Unlike most birds, which have large optic lobes for keen eyesight, the dodo had an unusually large and well-developed olfactory bulb. This strongly suggests that the dodo navigated its world not primarily by sight, but by smell, sniffing out the fallen fruits, nuts, and roots that made up its diet on the dark forest floor. Yet for all its successful adaptations, its reproductive strategy, that single precious egg laid in a simple nest of grass on the ground, would be its Achilles heel. The end began not with a bang, but with the creak of timber and the splash of an anchor. While Portuguese sailors may have been the first Europeans to glimpse Mauritius around 1507, the pivotal moment came in 1598, with the arrival of Dutch ships. Having evolved for millennia without fear of predators, the dodos were innately trusting and easily approached, making them simple targets for hungry sailors. But the common idea that humans simply hunted the dodo to extinction is too simple. While hunting certainly contributed, several accounts from sailors noted that dodo meat was tough, greasy, and just generally disgusting. The direct human hunt was just the opening act of a much larger ecological tragedy. The true devastation was an invasion, silent and insidious. The Dutch ships brought with them a host of stowaways and livestock that were alien to Mauritius: rats, pigs, dogs, cats, and monkeys. In an environment with no natural predators of their own, these invasive species exploded in number. They were perfectly equipped to exploit the dodo's greatest vulnerability, its single egg, laid defenseless on the forest floor. A single hungry pig could wipe out the reproductive efforts of an entire dodo population far more efficiently than a crew of sailors ever could. This biological assault was compounded by the physical destruction of the dodo's world. The Dutch began systematically felling the island's ancient forests, seeking valuable ebony wood for export to Europe and clearing land for settlements. This habitat destruction fragmented the remaining dodo populations, squeezing them into ever smaller pockets, where they were even more vulnerable to the new predators. Simply put, the dodo faced a three-pronged attack of hunting, invasive predators, and habitat loss that unraveled an ecosystem in less than a century. Pinpointing the exact moment the last dodo perished is a forensic analysis clouded by the fog of history. The last universally accepted sighting of a living dodo was made in 1662 by a shipwrecked Dutch sailor named Volkert Everts. He and his companions found the birds not on the main island, but on a small offshore islet, a telling detail that suggests the species had already been wiped out on the main island. After that, the trail goes cold, complicated by a case of mistaken identity and several later accounts which mention sightings of dodos into the 1670s and 1680s. However, linguistic and historical analysis suggests that as the true dodo disappeared, settlers transferred its familiar name to another flightless bird. This creature, called the red rail, is also now extinct, but without a clear physical description, these later textual references are ambiguous. But notably, modern science and statistical techniques have offered a new tool to peer into the silence and figure out when the dodo went extinct. In 2003, researchers applied a statistical method called optimal linear estimation to the known record of dodo sightings. By analyzing the decreasing frequency of reliable observations, the model calculated the statistical probability of the species' survival over time. The conclusion was that the dodo likely persisted, unseen and dwindling, for another generation after the 1662 encounter, and they arrived at a date of 1690 as most probable. Whatever the case, the last dodo perished alone, a century after its tropical Garden of Eden was shattered. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like and subscribe and tap the notification bell and turn on all notifications. And if you really want to take it to the next level, hit that join button or check out the Patreon to toss me a clam or two. In 1953, among the vast collections of a British nobleman, a map was rediscovered that sent a quiet shockwave through the world of historical cartography. Hand-painted on a single sheet of parchment in 1424 by a Venetian cartographer named Giovanni Pizzigano, it was a 500-year-old Portolan chart. This is a stunningly practical map of coastlines and ports designed for sailors. It depicted the familiar shores of Western Europe and North Africa with remarkable precision for its time. But out in the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic, west of the Azores, it showed something impossible. It was a large, nearly perfectly rectangular island, colored a bold, confident red, and labeled Antillia. Interestingly, Antillia wasn't a simple phantom island, but a powerful myth born from the ashes of a fallen kingdom. The story of Antillia begins with a civilizational disaster. In the year 711 AD, the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for centuries crumbled under the weight of an invasion by the Umayyad Caliphate. The last Visigothic king, Roderick, fell in battle, and within years, nearly all of what is now Spain and Portugal was under Muslim control. For the Christian population, it was a cataclysm. In the midst of this chaos, a legend of hope was born. The story, told and retold for centuries, centered on 7 Christian bishops who, led by the Archbishop of Porto, refused to submit to the new rulers. Around the year 714, they gathered their parishioners, boarded ships, and sailed west into the unknown Atlantic, a sea of monsters and myth, in search of a new home. According to the legend, they found it. After a perilous voyage, they landed on a large, fertile island where they established a Christian society, founding 7 cities. Each bishop was given the dominion over a city, and accounts even gave these settlements names, like Ira, Antua, and Ansali, lending a veneer of specificity to the tale. But the most crucial detail of the legend was a single dramatic act. Upon their arrival, the bishops ordered their ships to be burned. This was the point of no return. It transformed their desperate flight into a deliberate, permanent act of creation. They were no longer exiles, but founders, severing all ties to a homeland now lost to them. This story was a cultural and religious coping mechanism. In the face of civilizational collapse, it offered a narrative of continuity and divine sanction. It created an idealized Christian Visigothic Iberia that was safe, ordered, and pure, a stark contrast to the chaos of their conquered home. For 700 years, the story of the 7 bishops and their island sanctuary remained a powerful oral tradition. Then, in the 15th century, it took physical form. The 1424 Pizzigano chart gave Antillia its first known address, placing it firmly in the Atlantic. Its depiction was bizarre. Real islands aren't perfect rectangles, yet there it was, an impossibly geometric shape floating in the ocean. It was accompanied by a smaller archipelago, most notably a large blue rectangle to its north ominously named Satanazes, or the Isle of Devils. This pairing created a powerful symbolic geography in the middle of the ocean, a holy Christian sanctuary existing in direct opposition to a demonic, dangerous place. What's remarkable is that for the next 70 years, this strange depiction was copied by Europe's best map makers. Dozens of cartographers copied this Antillia group, along with the Devil Island, as if they were real places. This uniformity suggests they weren't plotting independent sightings, but were all working from a single, authoritative source that had become an accepted fact within the cartographic tradition. The name itself, Antillia, is widely believed to derive from the Portuguese ante ilha, meaning opposite island. This, combined with its rectangular shape, so similar to the outline of Portugal itself, has led many scholars to conclude that it was a symbolic projection. It was a piece of Portugal placed in the middle of the Atlantic. A phantom island on a map might seem like a historical curiosity, but Antillia had a very real impact on the world. During the 15th century, the legend transitioned from folklore to state policy. Portuguese monarchs, hungry for new lands and trade routes, treated Antillia as a plausible, even probable target for discovery. In a royal letter from 1475, King Afonso V granted the knight Fernão Teles the rights to the island and any other populated islands he might find in the western Atlantic. A decade later, in 1486, King John II issued a similar grant, authorizing another explorer to discover the island of 7 cities, a clear reference to Antillia. After 1492, As European ships began to crisscross the Atlantic, a problem emerged. Antillia wasn't where the maps said it was. Explorers charted the Caribbean, finding a vast archipelago of islands, but no trace of 7 Visigothic cities. The legend, however, was too powerful to just disappear. Its name was simply applied to the newly discovered islands, the modern Antilles, a place name marking where the myth was potentially supposed to be. The core concept of the 7 cities, meanwhile, proved just as resilient. It detached itself from its island host and migrated, projecting itself onto the vast, unexplored mainland of North America. The legend also mutated. The focus shifted from a pious Christian refuge to rumors of unimaginable material wealth. As the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, the rumored cities became the 7 cities of gold, thought to be located in the American Southwest. These 7 cities of gold represented an early fusion of Spanish and Aztec myth-making. As the 16th century progressed and transatlantic navigation became routine, the space on the map for Antillia simply vanished. It was initially speculated that the islands could be something smaller than was imagined, and could still be out there in the Atlantic. However, increased traffic and more accurate charting provided overwhelming negative evidence, and the idea of this island disappeared. The modern consensus is clear. Antillia was a phantom island, but there is one more question surrounding it. Some believe that Giovanni Pizzigano had simply added it based on a misunderstanding of the Azores. For reference, the Azores were first permanently settled by the Portuguese, and that may indicate why there was a Portugal shape representing it. Others have proposed that it potentially represented Bermuda, though this island wouldn't be discovered until the early 16th century. Its origin remains an ongoing subject of debate amongst scholars. Perhaps it's a garbled account of a real place like the Azores, a cartographic error copied for decades, or just a purely symbolic representation of hope. Whatever the case, the name Antillia is now immortalized in the archipelago of islands in the Caribbean. Deep in the dense rainforests of Sumatra, a mysterious creature is said to roam. Indigenous people have long told stories of a short, bipedal ape-like being known as the orang pendek. In Indonesian, orang pendek means short person, and this legend describes exactly that, a small human-like figure covered in hair, inhabiting some of the most remote mountain forests. And not to spoil this one, but there's a really good chance we actually do know what it is. And even though it's technically something ordinary, you're gonna be shocked. The legend of the Orang Pendek has deep roots in Sumatran culture. For generations, the forest-dwelling tribes of western Sumatra have spoken of a stocky, powerfully built little creature living alongside them in the jungle. Unlike many mythical beings, the Orang Pendek isn't typically regarded as a spirit or ghost by the locals. They traditionally considered the creature just as real as any other animal. Descriptions of the animal are strikingly consistent. The Orang Pendek is usually said to stand about 3 to 5 feet tall, walk upright on 2 legs, and be covered in short, dark fur. It's often described as having a muscular chest and arms, with strength so great that villagers say it can uproot small trees or snap thick branches. The creature is generally not seen as aggressive, and local tales say it avoids humans and will slip away quietly, though it may throw sticks or stones if threatened. Stories of the Orang Pendek remained relatively obscure to the outside world until the early 20th century, when Sumatra was under Dutch rule. During that time, a number of Dutch planters and explorers reported encounters with an unknown small wild man in the Sumatran forests. One of the first such accounts came from a hunter and settler in 1910, documented by the Dutch administration. In this report, a field overseer described seeing a creature about 40 feet away in the Baraseen Mountains. And that's an interesting name for the mountain. You're definitely going to want to keep that one in mind as we go forward. It was walking low to the ground, running like a human, but covered in hair, and definitely not an orangutan. The face, he noted with astonishment, was not like that of an ordinary human, yet not quite like an ape either. More sightings by Westerners soon followed, each leading to more scientific interest in the creature. In 1917, a Dutch settler encountered a mysterious figure while walking at the base of a Sumatran mountain. He saw what he first assumed was a person squatting on the forest floor. The quote-unquote person had the build of a small man with broad, square shoulders. However, when the entity stood up, the Dutchman realized that it was a hairy, ape-like creature. After a brief and tense moment, the animal calmly walked away on its two legs, then lifted up its long arms and started swinging into the dense jungle. Numerous other reports followed, all following a similar pattern, and all those who saw it were sure it couldn't be an orangutan. Despite these early reports, interest in the orang pendek faded in the mid-20th century. The upheavals of that time period and Indonesia's fight for independence occupied everyone's attention, and the creature remained a regional curiosity. For decades, it was seldom mentioned outside of local folklore. That changed in the late 20th century, when a new wave of explorers and researchers arrived in Sumatra, determined to find out once and for all what truth lay behind the legend. Starting in the 1980s, interest in the orang pendek increased substantially, both amongst Indonesians and in the outside world. Despite numerous expeditions having been conducted since that time, no conclusive evidence of the creature has ever turned up. However, new anecdotal sightings continue. This has led to some asking, with so many stories but no conclusive proof, what could explain the orang pendek phenomenon? One theory is that the orang pendek is a real but undiscovered great ape. Those who favor this idea point out that Sumatra is home to rich biodiversity, including the Sumatran orangutan, gibbons, and other primates. The orang pendek could be a ground-dwelling cousin of the orangutan, perhaps an evolutionary offshoot that adapted to life on the forest floor. Its reported physical traits appear to support this. Witnesses describe an animal with long arms, a thick torso, and significant body hair, all of which sounds ape-like. Unlike orangutans, which are arboreal and found in northern Sumatra, orang pendek sightings are mostly from the western central regions of the island. Some theorists believe it's conceivable that a small population of a new ape species lives in isolation there. Supporters also note that as recently as 2017, scientists officially identified a new species of orangutan, the Tapanuli orangutan, in Sumatra's ecosystem. In my view, this is a bit of a mischaracterization, to say the least. The Tapanuli orangutan was very much known to science for almost a century and was simply reclassified as a separate species of orangutan in 2017. Another theory suggests that orang pendek might not be an ape at all, but a surviving hominin, a relative of early humans. This idea gained popularity after the sensational discovery in 2003 of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit human species, on the Indonesian island of Flores. Those fossil skeletons revealed that tiny human relatives only about 4 feet tall lived in Indonesia as recently as 50,000 years ago, and perhaps even coexisted with modern humans. Under this theory, an unknown hominin species is what people have been seeing, with the hairiness generally explained by the fact that they may be wearing furs. But now let's finally get to the reason why this is truly a fascinating mystery. Skeptics offer simpler explanations for the orang pendek sightings. They propose that people in the forest may be seeing known animals but interpreting them as something mysterious due to unusual circumstances. One candidate often mentioned is the sun bear, a small bear native to Sumatra. Sun bears, when malnourished or suffering from disease, can lose much of their fur. They can also walk upright for prolonged periods of time and at a surprisingly rapid pace. An upright sun bear glimpsed through foliage might be mistaken for a hairy bipedal creature. In fact, there have been cases of sun bears standing on two legs and startling observers. Their stance can look eerily human from a distance. In mid-2023, a viral video posted on social media captured Angela, a Malayan sun bear at Hangzhou Zoo, standing upright and waving at spectators with a human-like posture. Its sagging skin folds looked like a baggy suit, leading viewers both online and in person to speculate the bear was a person in costume. The rumors spread online, fueled by disbelief that a real animal could look like that and mimic such human gestures. The zoo was forced to release a statement confirming that the sun bear wasn't a dude in a costume being used to drum up publicity. Imagine Edinburgh Castle on a cold November evening in 1440. Inside the Great Hall, a lavish banquet is underway. 10-year-old King James II sits at the head of the table, flanked by two teenage guests, the Douglas brothers, heirs of Scotland's most powerful noble family. Laughter and music fill the stone chamber until a servant presents a grisly centerpiece, the severed head of a black bull. Before the night is over, both Douglas heirs are beheaded in the castle yard, victims of a sensational act of betrayal that became known to history as the Black Dinner. It's a scene so dramatic and cruel that it sounds like fiction, yet it is all too real. Indeed, this medieval Scottish atrocity even helped inspire the infamous Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones. To understand why two noble youths were brutally slain at a royal dinner, we must set the stage in mid-15th century Scotland, a time of political turmoil and power struggles. 3 years earlier, in 1437, Scotland's King James I had been assassinated, leaving his son James II to inherit the throne at the tender age of 6. With a child king, the country fell under regency, and various factions of nobles vied for control of the government. One of the most formidable figures was Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas, the head of the mighty Black Douglas dynasty. Archibald was not only the kingdom's wealthiest magnate, but was even next in line to the throne, after little James II, thanks to intermarriages between the Douglases and the royal Stuart line. His influence was so great that he effectively served as regent for the boy king, until Archibald's sudden death from illness in 1439. Archibald Douglas's demise unleashed a fierce struggle for power. On one side was the widowed Queen Mother, Joan Beaufort, determined to protect her son's interests. On the other side were ambitious noblemen like Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander. These two men controlled key strongholds in Scotland and significant estates. Caught in the middle was the Douglas clan itself. Archibald's title and vast estates, virtually a principality within Scotland, passed to his teenage son William, the 6th Earl of Douglas, who was about 15 or 16 when he inherited in 1439. This youth suddenly became the most powerful noble in Scotland, at least on paper. But his very prominence made him a potential threat in the eyes of Crichton and Livingston. The two regents had no intention of letting the Douglas power overshadow their own grip on the kingdom. In fact, the Douglas family's influence was so extensive that many considered it a direct threat, not just to rival nobles, but even to the crown's authority. Through 1439 and 1440, the tension mounted significantly, and Crichton and Livingston jockeyed for dominance. They even went so far as to seize the young King James in a bid to control royal legitimacy. In essence, they agreed to keep him under their direct control, and most importantly, control access to who he was able to see and interact with. This not only allowed them to issue edicts in the king's name, but also raised the likelihood that Crichton and Livingston would remain close advisors of the king into his majority. Basically, they wanted to make themselves indispensable to King James in his minority, so that they would continue to influence him throughout his much longer majority. At the same time, they sought ways to neutralize the Douglas factor. The teenage Earl of Douglas, inexperienced, and next in succession to the throne after James II, was an obvious wild card in the political equation. Some sources suggest that by late 1440, the king's keepers had decided that the Douglas heir needed to be eliminated to secure their own power. Thus was born the diabolical plot that culminated in the Black Dinner. In November 1440, under the guise of reconciliation and friendship, William Douglas and his younger brother David received a royal invitation. They were asked to come to Edinburgh Castle to dine with King James II, who was by then 10 years old. The invitation likely seemed safe enough. After all, dining with the king implied royal hospitality and protection. The Douglas boys arrived accompanied by their advisor, Sir Malcolm Fleming, and perhaps a small retinue, expecting an evening of feasting and diplomacy. Unbeknownst to them, their hosts had other plans. The banquet began ordinarily, with tables laden and music playing. Accounts vary on the details, but legend has it that as the meal progressed, a dramatic and chilling signal was given. A covered platter was brought forth and placed before the Douglas brothers. When the lid was lifted, it revealed the head of a black bull, a dire omen that, in medieval Scotland, signified death. In that instant, the atmosphere flipped from merriment to terror. This was the cue for armed men, loyal to Chancellor Crichton, to burst into the hall and seize the young nobles. King James was present at the dinner according to later chronicles, and by some accounts he watched in horror as his guests, who were also his cousins, were grabbed by soldiers. One version of the story even claims the boy king begged for the lives of the Douglas brothers, protesting that violating the sacred guest right was evil and dishonorable. But if James pleaded, his guardians ignored him. The Douglas brothers were hauled out of the hall and down to Castle Hill, where a sham trial for treason awaited. Outside, under whatever pale moonlight November offered, an impromptu tribunal accused William and David Douglas of plotting against the crown. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, given that William Douglas was 16 and had shown no active rebellion at that point, and his younger brother was literally a kid. Nonetheless, the outcome was preordained, and in a matter of moments, the boys were declared guilty of treason. The appalled 10-year-old king could only look on as his guests were butchered under his nominal authority. The Black Dinner's horror lies not only in its brutality, but in the utter betrayal of trust it represented. In medieval culture, to slay invited guests under your roof was a crime heinous enough to bring divine curse upon a host. The incident flagrantly violated the code of hospitality and also of kinship, since they were the king's relatives. If the event is taken at face value, the crown's regents had hoped to cripple the Douglas clan by eliminating its young leaders. Then their plan didn't have the neat outcome they expected. And trust me, I'm going to get into that in a moment, because there's ample evidence to suggest that the Black Dinner was somehow far more sinister than it appears. In fact, if anything, it demonstrated how precarious Crichton and Livingston's control really was. News of the disturbing act spread quickly, and many members of the Douglas faction reacted with the appropriate fury given the circumstances. And you may notice that I said many members here, because someone very important, who is about to be introduced, didn't seem too broken up by the whole event. For the time being, though, the enraged portion of Douglas supporters retaliated by laying siege to Edinburgh Castle. Sir William Crichton, who they believed orchestrated the banquet and was holed up in the castle, suddenly found himself under assault by forces loyal to the family. Realizing his vulnerable position, Crichton surrendered the castle to the Douglas faction forces. Rather than being punished for his role, however, Crichton managed to escape retribution and even kept royal favor. He handed Edinburgh Castle directly over to the young king and was later formally rewarded with a title for giving up his castle, or at least, that was the official story at the time. This medieval Scottish mystery is about to take a very hard turn into deeply conspiratorial territory. With the 6th Earl and his brother dead, the Douglas titles and estates passed to their great-uncle, James Douglas, Earl of Avondale. He was a chunky, middle-aged man, ominously nicknamed James the Gross. Tellingly, despite his 2 young great-nephews having been brutally slain, James the Gross showed no intention of avenging them. This inaction raised eyebrows in this violent age. It was customary for Scottish kin to seek vengeance for such slayings, yet James the Gross did nothing. It almost seemed a little bit too convenient, since he would have never inherited these titles otherwise. The Douglas family as an institution continued to dominate the royal court and government offices, filling them with Douglas relatives and allies. When King James II finally came of age in 1449 and began ruling in his own right, he discovered that the Douglas clan still had a stranglehold on the kingdom. The Black Dinner had removed 2 Douglas boys, but it hadn't eliminated the family's influence. Curiously, it seemed to have the exact opposite effect, and the family only seemed to grow in power under the authority of the 7th Earl of Douglas, James the Gross. How very curious indeed. Over the next decade, James II struggled to assert his authority against the entrenched might of the Douglases. The bitterness of the 1440 betrayal lingered in living memory. Eventually, in 1452, King James took his own revenge in an eerie echo of the Black Dinner. He invited William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, the son of James the Gross, to Stirling Castle under a promise of safe conduct, then personally gutted him. This was a far cry from the boy king, who may have cried and tried to save his cousins by appealing to the rules of hospitality and the prohibitions against kinslaying. The 8th Earl of Douglas was, after all, both his guest and his kin. From the moment the Douglas boys were slain, one burning question has persisted. Who was truly behind the Black Dinner's heinous plot? The event had all the hallmarks of a carefully planned ambush rather than a spontaneous act. Yet the exact identity of its architect has been cloaked in some mystery, inviting debate among historians. At the time, popular opinion and later chronicles often blamed Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor, as the primary culprit. It was Crichton who controlled Edinburgh Castle and whose men physically carried out the arrests and executions. However, Crichton was not necessarily acting alone. Notably, Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, who shared power with Crichton during the king's minority, is often mentioned as an accomplice. Livingston was deeply involved in the Regency's power plays, and some sources list both Crichton and Livingston as co-conspirators who together orchestrated this dark dinner theater. The reasoning is that both men feared the Douglas influence and theoretically collaborated to break the Douglas clan's power by decapitating its leadership both literally and figuratively. And that was the official version of the story that was accepted at the time. However, in the warm light of day, centuries afterwards, Professional and amateur historians began to question this narrative. Beyond the royal advisors, intriguingly, suspicion also falls on a member of the Douglas clan itself. Modern historians increasingly view James the Gross, the victim's great uncle who inherited the earldom, as a key beneficiary and perhaps the silent mastermind of the Black Dinner. At first glance, it sounds counterintuitive. Why would a Douglas betray his own kin in such a horrific manner? Well, if you've played Crusader Kings, you may have been able to intuitively figure out the answer to this already. James the Gross was an older cadet of the family with comparatively modest holdings, until his young great-nephew came along as Earl. If his great-nephews died without heirs, James stood to gain the entire Douglas inheritance instantly, and that is exactly what happened. By removing the two boys, James the Gross became 7th Earl, suddenly in possession of the vast Douglas possessions. Notably, in the wake of the Black Dinner, James not only took over the Douglas estates, but also aligned politically with Crichton. Modern scholars find the case against James the Gross compelling. They point out the telling detail that after becoming Earl, James never sought vengeance for William and David, an unusual omission in that era of Scottish feuds. His failure to prosecute or punish Crichton looks highly suspicious at the very least. Further, it makes virtually no sense strategically why Crichton would want to slay the two inexperienced brothers, knowing that their vast lands would fall to James the Gross. James the Gross had already proven himself to be a capable and dangerous man, unlike the two brothers. If Crichton had really wanted to diminish the power of the Douglas clan, it's argued that he would have only taken out the 16-year-old, leaving the much younger brother in charge. For reasons that make no sense strategically, he simply chose to remove both brothers, handing full control of this powerful clan to a capable rival. Crichton was heavily embroiled in late medieval power politics, and had proven himself to be very effective at advancing his own position. It seems unlikely that such a formidable man could make such a great oversight, especially given the conduct of James the Gross afterwards. Notably, contemporaries don't seem to have suspected James the Gross as being involved whatsoever, which strikes me as unusual. To put it in language that'll be familiar to all my Crusader Kings 3 players out there, it seems to me that James the Gross must have had a ridiculously high intrigue stat. Though I suppose perhaps not quite high enough, since James the Gross was one successful scheme away from becoming James III of Scotland, but of the House of Douglas, not Stuart. The Black Dinner of 1440 remains one of Scotland's most infamous betrayals, a night when dinner guests became victims and a royal castle became the scene of an atrocity. Its legacy has all the elements of a dark legend. Innocent young nobles, scheming lords, a duplicitous feast, and a violation of the ancient laws of hospitality. The mystery of who conceived this deed will likely continue to fascinate historians for generations. However, today, the prevailing view is that it was a conspiracy of interested parties. Most believe that Chancellor Crichton, Regent Livingston, and James the Gross all had their hands in the plot.